In a fiery televised exchange, Piers Morgan had meticulously prepared for a battle of words, ready to corner Ibrahim Traoré. What no one anticipated, however, was how Traoré would neutralize the charged atmosphere with a single, serene, and profoundly sincere statement. The studio audience was left in a state of shock. Piers was rendered momentarily speechless, and audiences worldwide felt an unexpected surge of emotion. Moved to tears by the sheer honesty and dignity of his words, an electric anticipation hummed. Through the studio, Piers Morgan sat at his desk, shuffling his papers, his trademark scowl firmly in place. His guest for the evening was Ibrahim Traoré, the youthful and resolute transitional president of Burkina Faso. Piers lived for such high-stakes confrontations. This was destined to be far from a cordial chat. The recording lights glowed red. A producer's voice called the final seconds. 3, 2, 1. Tonight, Piers launched in, his tone edged with steel. We are joined by a man who has cut a controversial figure on the global stage, hailed as a hero by some, condemned as reckless by others. President Ibrahim Traoré, welcome. Traoré offered a slight nod, his composure a quiet force that seemed to unnerve his adversaries more effectively than any display of anger. Piers, wasting no time, leaned forward. You have made choices that have resulted in fatalities. There are those who say you're courting disaster. Do you possess any sense of guilt, or are you simply skilled at hiding it? The tension in the room became almost tangible. Traoré remained perfectly still. He met Piers's gaze directly and asked, his voice low, "Are you certain you want the answer?" The simple query, delivered with such gravity, momentarily threw even the seasoned interviewer off his rhythm. At home, viewers instinctively moved closer to their screens, sensing that something in Traoré's eyes promised a revelation nobody was truly prepared for. The silence hung in the air, stretching for an unnervingly long moment. Piers cleared his throat, struggling to reclaim his command of the situation. Yes, he asserted, a touch too defensively. I do want to know. Don't try to tell me you have no regrets, Mr. President. We all do. Traoré steepled his fingers, his gaze never leaving Piers. He let out a slow, measured breath. My regret, he started, is not the one you're anticipating. The words were spoken softly, yet they sliced through the studio's atmosphere like a razor. Piers arched an eyebrow, silently daring him to proceed. All over the world, people were transfixed, glued to their devices. Feeling the escalating pressure, a change came over Traoré's face. It wasn't anger or coldness, but a profound and relatable humanity. My regret, he repeated, his voice now trembling almost imperceptibly, is that children still exist who look upon me with eyes that say I have failed to keep them safe. A profound stillness fell over the studio. Piers's follow-up question died on his lips. On social media, short videos of the exchange were already beginning to circulate. Children who look at me as though I've failed them. For the very first time that evening, the hard lines of Piers's face seemed to dissolve, and Traoré himself looked to be on the verge of tears. The next question never materialized. Instead, Piers set down his pen and leaned back slightly, appearing uncertain of his next move. But Traoré continued to speak, his voice a quiet current that nonetheless filled the studio. I am haunted by their faces each night, he confessed. In the refugee camps, on the streets ravaged by conflict, children with vacant eyes, asking why we allowed this to happen to them. And I don't have a sufficient answer for them. Not yet. A hush settled over the room. Even the production crew in the shadows ceased their movements. Piers's characteristic fire had been extinguished. He now looked at Traoré as if truly seeing him for the first time. How Piers finally managed to whisper, "How do you bear that weight?" Traoré shut his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them. They were moist, but his gaze was unwavering, because, he stated, if I do not bear it, who else will? Candace Owens, seated off-camera as a guest commentator, was captured in a close-up. She bit her lower lip, visibly wrestling with her emotions. It was a rare moment of vulnerability. For her, I've never heard anything like this, she murmured, her voice barely audible on her microphone. Millions watching from their homes shared the sentiment. The questions grew harsher. Piers was back in his element, leaning in, his finger punctuating. The air, as he spoke, you speak of sacrifice. Mr. Traoré, Piers pressed, his volume increasing. Yet Burkina Faso's economy is in dire straits. You've expelled foreign military forces. You've severed relationships with influential allies. Some argue you have condemned your own people to make a political statement. Do you have any concern for them? Or is this all about your ego? A palpable discomfort rippled through the studio audience. Even Traoré's interpreter appeared tense, but Traoré's composure was absolute. He held Piers's gaze, as serene as a placid lake at sunrise. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might not deign to reply at all. Then, very softly, he asked, "Do you believe I can sleep through the sound of children crying?" The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Piers froze, his breath caught in his chest. Viewers at home felt the impact. The silence was profound. Traoré made a small adjustment to his jacket, as if bracing himself for what would follow. The tension was now heavier, more oppressive. This was no longer a simple interview. It was transforming into an event from which no one could turn away. The camera zoomed in tight on his face as he went on, his voice remaining low but firm. "One morning, I was standing outside the shell of a burned-out school," Traoré began. "There was a young girl, no more than 6. She was clutching her brother's hand. He had already passed, but she hadn't realized it yet. She just kept repeating, 'He's sleeping, he's sleeping.'" He paused. The studio was utterly silent. "She looked up at me," he continued, his own eyes now glistening, "and asked if I could wake him up. And I couldn't. I couldn't." A soft gasp was heard from the audience. This time, even Piers did not interject. "I carry her eyes with me every single day," Traoré said. "I carry the eyes of every child who has pleaded with me to mend something I cannot yet fix, and that is the reason I continue to fight. Not for ego, but because I refuse to witness another little girl beg me to wake up her dead brother." Piers's expression had softened again. His pen lay forgotten on the desk. No one had foreseen this, least of all him. For the first time in his long career, Piers Morgan was at a loss for words. The retort was stuck in his throat. He looked at Traoré, then down at his own notes, which now seemed insignificant and petty. The cameras continued to roll, as Ibrahim Traoré simply sat there, his gaze unwavering, his hands folded, waiting. The audience erupted, not with applause, but with tears. People silently dabbed at their eyes, unable to avert their gaze. On social media, the clip of that single sentence, "Do you think I sleep through the sound of children crying?" was already achieving viral status. Comment sections overflowed with hearts, crying emojis, and phrases like, "This man is a true leader, and I never knew his story. Now I'm weeping." Even Piers, a man who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, had to clear his throat before speaking again. When he did, his voice was gentler. "How do you continue," he asked, "when the weight of it all must seem unbearable?" Traoré offered a faint, weary smile, and his next words would leave everyone watching completely shattered. The question Piers posed next was pointed. Why not step down if the price is so steep? Why subject yourself and your people to all this suffering? The words hung in the studio air. The cameras focused on Traoré. He remained silent for such a long time that the audience began to stir. Restlessly, even Piers started to frown, perhaps anticipating a deflection or an evasion of the question. At last, Traoré let out a long breath and said quietly, "Because my people were never given the option to step aside." The room froze. When terrorists invaded their homes, he went on, they were not given a choice. When their crops were set ablaze, they were not given a choice. When their children went hungry, they were not given a choice. So why should I be given one? A murmur spread through the audience. A woman in the front row brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes already wet with tears. Even Piers offered no immediate response. Traoré's calm delivery somehow made the words feel even more potent. The bright studio lights seemed to dim. The only sounds were quiet breathing, and in homes around the world. The soft rustle of people reaching for tissues as the cameras continued to roll. Traoré reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. "This," he stated, holding it up for all to see, "is the reason I do not quit." The audience leaned forward. Piers leaned forward. "It is from a mother," Traoré clarified. A woman I met just last month after her son was killed while defending his village. She gave this letter to me. He unfolded it with delicate care, his hands betraying no tremor despite the emotional weight of his words. She wrote. He began to read aloud. President Traoré, if you are to fall, let it be a fall forward, so that even in your descent, we will know someone was fighting on our behalf. He paused, his gaze dropping to the paper. Then he looked directly at Piers, his voice barely a whisper. How do I tell her son that I gave up? Piers swallowed with difficulty, his pen slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the desk. For the first time in his professional life, his combative facade crumbled entirely. At home, untold numbers of viewers wiped tears from their faces. The online comments poured in. I've never cried during an interview before. He is the voice for all of us. Piers cleared his throat, but his voice still cracked. You speak of children, he said, fighting to hold on to his composure. But what of you, Mr. Traoré? What have you personally sacrificed? The question appeared to take even Traoré by surprise. His eyes fell to the floor, and when he lifted them again, his expression had undergone a subtle transformation. I have sacrificed myself, he said with stark simplicity. The words landed with the force of a punch. He elaborated, my family seldom sees me. My own mother lives in constant fear for my safety. I have lost friendships. I have lost sleep, and there are moments when I believe I have even lost touch with who I am. The tears were now shimmering in his eyes, but his gaze remained fixed. The studio audience held its collective breath. Piers leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. His lips quivered as he whispered, almost inaudibly, I've never heard this before. Those 6 words resonated through the studio like a solemn bell. Even the producers behind the scenes stood motionless, and millions of viewers worldwide felt their hearts break open. The cameras kept rolling, but no one in the studio moved. The makeup artist in the corner was frozen, a tissue clutched to her cheek. Ibrahim Traoré's words hung in the air like a sacrament. I've sacrificed myself, he had said. And now, the silence spoke volumes. Piers looked at him with new eyes. His typical fire was gone, replaced by something gentler, something akin to respect. He leaned forward again, his voice softer this time. Do you ever have regrets? He asked. Traoré took a deep, heavy breath. I regret their ongoing suffering, he said. I regret that I have not yet accomplished enough. But I cannot regret my presence here, because if I were to leave, who would they have? The audience was now openly weeping. Even the cameraman's hands trembled slightly. For the first time in his career, Piers did not cut in, and at home, millions of viewers clutched their chests, understanding they were witnessing something far more significant than politics. From the back of the studio, a voice whispered loud enough for the microphones to catch. He's telling the truth. It was unclear who had spoken, but it didn't matter. That single quiet declaration seemed to break. A dam, the audience stirred, murmuring in assent, some nodding through their tears. Traoré's eyes swept across the room. He saw a young woman in the second row, her face streaked with mascara as she cried into her sleeve. Piers noticed it too, and for the first time that evening, he stepped out of his role as host. He turned toward the audience. What do you see? When you look at him, a man stood up, his voice unsteady. I see a person who shows more concern for strangers than our own leaders show for us, he declared. The crowd's murmur grew louder. Traoré remained silent, his hands clasped in his lap, allowing their words to occupy the space. One by one, others spoke, calling him a hero, a symbol of hope, and Piers. Piers just sat there, his eyes glistening, struggling to maintain his composure. The final instruction came quietly, not from Piers or the audience, but from the director via Piers's earpiece. We're out of time. Wrap it up. But Piers didn't move. He stared at Traoré for a long, silent beat. Then he asked, if you had a single message for the entire planet at this moment, what would it be? The audience held its breath. The camera pushed in on Traoré's face. He looked directly into the lens and spoke, his voice calm, sincere, and resolute. The people you disregard today will be the ones to bury your children tomorrow. Therefore, choose love. Choose them. Choose humanity before it is too late. The room fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Piers blinked rapidly, but no words came. His throat had constricted. He simply nodded slowly, almost as if in defeat, but profoundly moved. The clip detonated on the internet within minutes. By night's end, it was ubiquitous. The sentence that shook the world, the headlines proclaimed. At home, people watched. Through tears, knowing they had just witnessed history, and they couldn't look away, the studio lights dimmed as the program concluded. But outside, the world was ablaze. Clips of Ibrahim Traoré's calm, penetrating words inundated social media. On Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, hashtags like #TruthOverPolitics and #Ibrahim, Traore, speaks shot to the #1 trending spot. People from every nation reposted his words. The people you ignore today are the people who will bury your children tomorrow. So, choose love, choose them, choose humanity before it's too late. Piers remained in the studio, still processing. The event, the man who typically eviscerated his guests, had been left with nothing to say. He just sat in his chair, staring at his hands. Producers scurried about, their phones ringing off the hook. The audience filed out in silence, many still dabbing at their eyes. Meanwhile, Traoré slipped out a back exit of the studio into the crisp London night. "I will never forget tonight." He offered only a gentle smile and continued on his way. But inwardly, even he was starting to grasp that he had ignited something far larger than himself. That same evening, back in Burkina Faso, a current of jubilation and solidarity surged through the streets. Families gathered around radios and TVs, rewatching clips of their president's powerful words. People wept openly, embracing one another. "He spoke for us," they shouted. "He told them our truth." In her home in Ouagadougou, Traoré's mother watched the clip on a small television. Tears traced silent paths down her cheeks as she whispered a prayer for him. She picked up her phone and typed a brief, potent message. "My son, you have brought our pain into the light. Stay strong, we are behind you." In his London hotel room, Traoré read her text in solitude. For the first time all day, his composed exterior fractured. He pressed his forehead against his hands and allowed himself to weep silently for all, the people he had yet to save, for all the mothers still awaiting their son's return. For a brief instant, he wondered if it was enough. But then he rose, dried his eyes, and composed himself. Phone rang. It was Piers Morgan. His voice was different now, stripped of its usual combativeness. "Ibrahim," he started, a hint of awkwardness in his tone. I just wanted to express my gratitude." A long pause followed. "You weren't just speaking to me last night," Piers went on, his voice cracking slightly. "You were speaking to everyone, and I would be honored if you would come back. There are more things I believe the world needs to hear from you." Traoré was quiet for a moment before answering. "Thank you, Piers," he said softly. "I will return, but only on the condition that you are prepared to listen, not merely to question." The line was silent, but Piers eventually replied, "I'm ready." And for the first time in a long while, he felt a surge of hope, not for himself. To see him, some held signs. "You speak for us. Truth still matters. Thank you, Ibrahim." Piers met him at the entrance this time, not as an adversary, but almost as an ally. He understood the immense weight his next words would carry, not just for tonight, but for the future. In his mind's eye, he saw the faces of his people. Farmers tilling arid land. Children with vast, hungry eyes, mothers holding their breath for sons to come home from war. When the door swung open and he stepped, once more, into the brilliant glare of the lights, the room fell silent. This was no longer just another interview. "Last time you spoke of humanity. Why is it so important that the world listens?" "People are resistant to change." A long, weighty silence ensued. Traoré's hands were still resting calmly in his lap. He did not hurry his response. Finally, he looked Piers directly in the eye and spoke, his voice gentle. "Because even if they do not change, you can—" Piers froze, his mouth slightly agape. The words sank in like stones, dropping into a deep, still well. From the audience, a quiet gasp was heard. Traoré continued, "Change does not begin with the world. It begins with you. One heart." At a time, the silence that followed was absolute. Piers lowered his gaze, utterly speechless, and across the globe, humanity was all that remained. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, the applause did not. The audience rose to its feet. Many were crying. Some reached out simply to touch his hand. Piers approached him, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Ibrahim. I will never forget this." Traoré smiled faintly and answered, "This isn't about me, Piers. It's about what you choose to do now." That night, as he departed the studio, the rain had ceased. The same crowd was still there, waiting, and they cheered as he emerged. Traoré waved to them, his heart full. He knew he could not solve everything in a day or a week, but he had planted a seed that might just take root even in the most unforgiving soil, and perhaps, just perhaps, the world was finally ready to help it grow. If this account moved you, resonated with your heart, or even brought you to tears, please don't hesitate to like this, subscribe to my channel, and share in the comments. Which part affected you the most? Let us share this moment of raw humanity together and ensure the conversation continues. Truth over politics?